Okay, we're live. This is our weekly basic income discussion group, and today we're talking about economic growth. And before that, Bethany wanted to mention a couple things about classes she knows about.
So now it's awkward. It's a continuation of a previous conversation that was happening before.
All right, so we're not going to do that.
I'll work it in seamlessly later.
Yeah, so some of us read an article. That's not good. Some of us read an article called Sooner or Later We'll Have to Stop Economic Growth and We'll Be Better for It. This is from Ensia Magazine, which is, it's an article by Richard Heinberg from a few years ago. So I think when we talk about economic growth, it might be good to ask the question, what exactly is growing? When we're talking about the size of the economy, what do we mean? What do we typically mean in our everyday discourse and when economists talk about it? And what should we mean? What should we think of as the size of the economy? And he thinks that's something that needs more coverage, not just measuring items and services that are counted towards gross domestic product that measure productivity instead of consumer satisfaction and more broadly happiness. So economists typically talk about GDP when they're talking about the size of the economy, and they talk about economic growth, they're talking about growth of GDP. So is that the right thing to measure the size of the economy? Is the size of everyone's happiness the right measure of the size of the economy? Or is that something that's also important but maybe orthogonal, and the size of the economy is something we should care about, and is GDP the right measure for that? So I kind of want to start by going around the room and asking people what they think we should be talking about when we talk about the size of the economy and what it should mean to have economic growth.
What should we be talking about? So I think it a little bit depends on your purpose. Like if you're interested in the workings of the economy, then you're interested in the things that people are trading kind of money for, or that like there's some sort of system of trade going on. And if you're interested in kind of the well-being of the society, you might want to broaden it. Because, for example, services that are offered for free wouldn't be counted in the economy, and there are all sorts of sort of tech issues that would be too limiting if you're interested in just kind of like how much people are benefiting from your government doing well to sort of set up human welfare, or whatever that question might be. What was the other question? Is GDP? Is that right?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm a little bit contaminated by your perspective on GDP as I am on just about everything else. And I don't know a lot about GDP. But it does, like how do they count like stock growth and stuff like that, for example? I think I'd have to know more about.
That's not part of GDP.
I think I'd have to know more about GDP to comment on that, so I'll wait on
that. So when we talk about like the economy growing or like whatever, it always feels sort of weird to me. Like, okay, but like why does that actually matter? Like I'm sure there are academic ways in which it matters to like think, like Bethany said about like trade and stuff, like there are ways in which that matters, but the way that we use it to proxy for like, oh, that means that our country is like doing well always seems sort of confusing. Makes me like, okay, but I don't really care about like if this like abstract thing is like growing, like there are like children similar to Bethany, like I don't know, GDP seems flawed in a lot of ways, but I also don't feel like I care about what it's sort of attempting to measure, and so I don't have a good sense of I'm sure that it could be improved, but I don't have a lot of thoughts about that. It feels like if we wanted to talk about the sort of like economic success of the country or the well-being of the country, that there would be different ways to get at that, to be like, okay, how many people are like at subsistence level, how many people are comfortable, like something more like that. They get like, so not just like, I don't know, maybe that means like dividing the country up into like quartiles and being like, cool, who's in these different quartiles, but and that is like in some ways might be more effective than like a happiness index. I think I worry a little bit about sort of like if people feel like, oh, I'm so like dissatisfied. I don't know a lot about the happiness literature, so I know there's a lot of different ways that you can measure like, are you satisfied with your, like there's a lot of different ways to frame it. And so I feel like if you're in like a very like corporate rat race and you're like, oh, I feel like really dissatisfied with my life because I only have a small mansion and all of my peers have giant mansions like that. It's like, okay, I mean, we care about that, kind of, but that feels like it's different than what people are trying to get at when they want a happiness index. So I wonder if they're more effective ways. And so I don't know if that's asking better calibrated questions about happiness, or if it's about like, oh, maybe we can do things that are more about like mortality rates and different kind of stuff that gets at overall well-being.
Like quality adjusted life years and stuff like that.
Yeah. Which is like, I mean, like that's also complicated. There's a lot of disability politics around quality adjusted life years, but
yeah.
But yeah.
The right measure.
Okay, Richard.
Another way to look at the economy is the donut economy. You can look up that.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I've seen that. We can bring it up here.
Is it like the Big Mac Index? Or?
No, this is like, it's not about actual donuts.
No, it's about like the environment. It's like the outside, and the inside is like the economy or something like that. I don't really.
A healthy economy should be designed to thrive, not grow. TED Talk from Kate Rayworth, who's written a book called Donut Economics.
It's this thing. So the idea is that you want to get each of these dimensions inside the ideal circle. Like that's the Goldilocks ring there. And if it's too high, then you have problems, and if it's too low, then maybe you have problems. I think.
Is there such a thing as too low climate change, or?
I'm not a huge fan of this way of thinking about the economy, to be honest. I mean, I think there's obviously a balance to be had in terms of, I think you want to minimize pollution, but then of course there's trade-offs. If you minimize it too much, then maybe we're not doing anything beneficial for people and people are starving or something like that. So of course there's all kinds of trade-offs in the economy. I don't know if it can really be, if this is really a useful way to conceptualize it.
This seems like it's saying the opposite of like this seems like it would imply that having too low pollution is bad in and of itself, regardless of what you may have sacrificed or not sacrificed.
I think it's about like water and stuff being in that donut. So like, see how it says like on the outside ring ecological ceiling, and then in the inner ring social foundation. So I think the idea is that there's a Goldilocks range of like an appropriate amount of consumption of water and other natural resources. So it's like.
So it's trying to consume at the rate that things are naturally kind of available.
Or in the way that's sustainable for sustained human prosperity or something like that. So you need a minimum of resource usage to provide a social foundation, but you don't want to go above the ecological ceiling of what the environment can sustain. I think that's the message here, and that's a good message, but I don't know, maybe this is useful to some people. Yeah. So what do you think about the size of the economy and how we should think about it, what economic growth means?
I think econometrics is an absolute go rodeo. I'm sure there are a lot of very smart people who do a lot of very interesting work in it, and for all of that work, I honestly don't think that anybody has a good grasp of how to measure an economy. It's worth doing. I think I'm kind of okay with GDP compared to other measures I've heard, at least for some things. The concept is supposed to be like a measure of what you're capable of producing, like the power your country has to make stuff. I'm not sure I have a better measure of that, but it doesn't mean I like it. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think I liked what people said. Ultimately, in our society, I think what we care about is people's well-being. So that's kind of like the happiness index, but also, being well-nourished and, living, like all the things that kind of correspond to well-being. I think that's ultimately what we care about. And then the economy is part of that. So I don't know if it makes sense to substitute a happiness index and replace, the size of the economy with the size of everyone's happiness. I think the economy is, people can derive well-being from some of the stuff they get out of the economy. So there's some stuff that's not measured in economic output that people benefit a lot from, even some human activity, like caring activities and all kinds of things like that. And that's fine. I don't think that's a problem with the economy or a problem with how we measure the economy. I do think there is a little bit of a problem with how we measure the economy using GDP, which is that ultimately, I mean, we care about people's well-being, and as far as the economy goes, we care about the extent to which the economy is contributing to people's well-being. So that means we probably want to focus on consumption rather than production. We want to focus on how much people are getting out of the economy rather than how much they're putting into the economy, because that's what ultimately translates to well-being. I've said the word ultimately like 10 times.
Is there a reason that we're picking one metric? Like most serious economists, I assume, would write about GDP along with probably at least a dozen other metrics.
Sure. So there's all kinds of
which are probably consumption based.
Right. So there's all kinds of different ways of measuring the overall economy and measuring components of the economy, and all of that. You're absolutely right about that. But I think when we're looking at these different measurements, it's good to anchor them in kind of the big picture. And the big picture is how is the economy benefiting people? Because we care about people. So that's why I like to, from a big picture perspective, think about what's being produced for people, what people are able to consume, rather than maybe what's kind of being put out there by our production. So that's my objection to GDP.
Can I add to the answer?
Yeah.
So like within high-level economists, I don't know, but in terms of political discourse and kind of general discourse, I would say that GDP has a lot of pull, and like people certainly think it's better if we're manufacturing more stuff and sending it elsewhere than if we're getting a lot of cheap manufactured stuff into the country. And
Right.
Alex's framework would reverse that. So I think that's like a pretty large scale conception that has more weight than some of the others.
Right. I would
At
say
least
that,
in politics.
that imports are better than exports. If we can get cheap stuff from China, that's better for us. We're getting cheap stuff. That's great. Right. That would be like if there's a business that's selling really cheap things. Or
There are some
something like
labor ethics questions with that.
there's some if we're caring about we're going to frame it differently depending on whether we just care about Americans or whether we care about everyone, and including Chinese laborers. So then the question of if we care about the entire world, including Chinese laborers, what's the best way to help them? Is it to reduce imports from China? Hard to say. China has a habit of making up work for people to do, and really just making them do the work and building things that are completely unnecessary, like cities that nobody lives in and stuff like that. So it's unclear that if we stopped importing things from China, that the Chinese laborers would somehow be better off, because they make up work for people to do anyway. I think like big picture, like goals, I would love to help people in China. I don't know if trade agreements are going to be very effective in that, unless you can negotiate in such a way that China agrees to treat their people better if you trade with them or that kind of thing.
But can I get it
Yeah.
back to like his economic point would just be that most people might say it's better for Americans to be exporting than importing.
Right.
Not that I discount your point about the Chinese, but in terms of like how people would think about the economics.
Right.
Does
And I would say it's-
maybe you
it's-
disagree. That's my impression.
Even that, like, there are advantages to it. Yeah, I like being able to get cheap goods. It's probably disadvantageous if you had if you work in the manufacturing industry.
Well, that's
here.
where
Right.
that's where
So-
Alex feels yeah.
Yeah.
Which
This
is
all
probably
ties
why
into
we
how
act
Alex
on
feels
it.
about many topics that are different from how most people feel about.
Yeah, so the problem with that is that now what you're doing is making up work for people to do as an excuse to pay them. So if we could easily get cheap steel from China or cheap cars from China or something, and we're saying, no, we don't want this cheap stuff because we want to force our own people to do it, that feels problematic to me.
Yeah, I think I'm in your camp.
Yeah.
Under the precondition that we have something like a UBI or something where we aren't requiring people to do work that we are then taking away from them.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing because if you don't have a basic income, then that creates an incentive for us to kind of keep doing what we've been doing, which is to find ways to make up work for people to do, find ways to introduce inefficiencies in the labor market. Then if you have a basic income, that can, I agree with you, it's kind of like a precondition. Like a lot of people say, well, once the jobs are eliminated, we need a basic income. But I think you can also think about it the other way around. Like you were just saying that once you have the basic income, now you can eliminate the jobs. You don't have to feel guilty about make it so people don't have to work anymore, that kind of thing. So I like that.
You also need a large enough economy to support a basic income.
Can you say more about that?
Like if you're really poor, your country's really poor, you're not going to be able to
Hey, come on in.
have the resources to provide for the people, unless it's just like $5 a month or something.
Feel free to have some cake, by the way.
Yeah, there's cake. Nobody's eating this cake.
No, people are eating it. It's just a
Oh, they
lot
are?
of cake.
Oh, okay, good. That barely makes a dent.
Yeah, so Richard, you're absolutely right. Consumers can't buy things if there's nothing for them to buy. They can't spend if there's nothing for that money to go toward. So in order for basic income to work, or in order for incomes from jobs to work too, people need something to buy with that money. If
your workforce isn't well educated or skilled enough, then they're not going to be able to work or produce the things that you need to buy.
Yeah. So we've talked in this group about economies like Venezuela and some other places where, if you gave people the money, they wouldn't necessarily be able to buy anything with it because the economy doesn't have the capacity to produce what they would buy. So that certainly, you need to get some kind of productive capacity in order for people to be able to spend their money that you give them or that they earn from their jobs. It's the same thing if you're making up jobs for people to do. It's, they're still not going to be able to spend that money if they can't buy anything with it.
Or if you don't have the factories to produce anything.
Right, if you don't have the factories to produce anything.
Or ports to import things.
Exactly.
It's a little crammed in there.
Yeah. So yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I like what you say in terms of economic growth.
Yeah.
One perspective that I like is how you call the economy a giant anti-poverty machine. And I think that's like a really different spin, because like I think when the term economic growth comes to mind, sometimes it conjures images of like endless plastic bottles or something like that. But when you also think of the economy as an anti-poverty machine, which it also is, then it brings up some of the positive associations of economic growth. Like that means feeding more of the world and housing more of the world and giving internet to more of the world, and that's also a form of economic growth.
And there's a difference between economic growth and growth in the amount of resources we use,
right? Exactly.
Or waste. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people kind of lump those two things together.
Yeah, for sure.
But also there's this idea that economic growth, that in order for the economy to be okay, it has to keep growing or something like that. And I don't think that's right either.
Right.
I think if you talk about the size of the economy as the amount of stuff that the economy is producing for consumers for their benefit, then certainly if it gets bigger, then that's more benefit for consumers. But if it stays the same size, that doesn't mean they're not going to keep getting their existing benefit. Right. And have that, go ahead.
Japan's economy hasn't really grown in 25 years, and they're doing really well. So you don't really need economic growth.
In terms of well-being of the consumers, yeah. So let's get into a quote from the article. So this is actually from the subheading. The end of growth will come one day, perhaps very soon, whether we're ready or not. You guys agree with this? Does growth have to end? Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, if we mine asteroids or something, we won't need to worry about the resources of our own planet.
I was going to say, this quickly becomes a physics question, like, do we live in a finite universe? If yes, then clearly quod erat demonstrandum.
Right, yeah, so that's what a lot of people would say, but then I would say that might be, again, kind of conflating the idea of economic growth with the idea of resource usage.
Yeah, I agree.
So you could have X amount of resource usage and invent a technology that creates some benefit for consumers without using any more resources. That's economic growth without an increase in the amount of resources.
Or like more people having the time to teach yoga if that's paid for is also economic growth. It doesn't have to be something that we traditionally associate with.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand
really
the
take this
abstract.
to an extreme.
The heat death of the universe will be the end of economic growth. Yes, if you want to take it to
if
that
it is a
extreme.
finite universe, there's finite, like, total information that can exist.
Right.
Your economy can't exceed that information.
Yeah. I suspect that's what he was going for.
So I don't think that's what he's talking about here.
But it's a valid point.
I think he's worried about the more immediate resources on the planet.
Yeah.
In fact,
I do think that's really an important distinction too, because well, as you mentioned, like things that could make resource use more efficient, or things that are just services that don't use up that many more resources, don't really clearly sort of factor in there.
Right. And it's also another thing to keep in mind is that, if we have finite resources on the planet and we are continually using them up, even without growth in that resource usage, we'd still be, depleting things.
Right.
There's some resources that are renewable and we can consume sustainably. They're often fed by energy from the sun or something like that, which obviously the sun's going to run out at some point, but not within the time frame that we're talking about when we talk about the economy. So there's some sustainable resources that we can keep using indefinitely, but then there's some that aren't. And even without any growth, just the using of those resources at the same steady rate will deplete them. So I think a lot of times when people talk about growth, they're worried that it means we'll use more, but really we're always going to be using more as we're using stuff.
Right.
And it's just like the rate at which we use stuff.
So another way to put that might be like that's still something we need to, like an issue we need to contend with, whether or not we're growing, shrinking, staying the same.
Right. We still need to contend with whether we're using resources sustainably.
Some of that, like, even the term using resources is kind of implying this model of you have a thing and then you use it and it is destroyed.
Right.
Which is kind of antithetical to the whole idea of like a sustainable economy where
Right.
hopefully you aren't really destroying much of anything. Hopefully the metal that you made into a chair is still a chair there 300 years from now if you'd made it really well.
Right.
Or it's in something else.
And there's using and then there's using up, right?
Right.
So there are plenty of things we can use without using them up. There are durable resources that can be reused, recycled, repurposed, that kind of thing. But then there are resources that we can use up sustainably too. Like we could use up a tree and grow a new tree and have a tree farm or something like that. Anyone have any more thoughts about this particular quote before I move on to the next one?
I've developed for myself at least a rule of thumb,
Yeah.
which is I think sustainable to me means can last about 1,000 years.
Fair enough.
So a sustainable activity would be an activity that could last
An
1,000 years?
An activity whose byproducts won't destroy it within 1,000 years.
Okay.
I would consider solar energy sustainable if I thought we could create solar panels for the next 1,000 years without running out of lithium, sodium, whatever else we choose to use.
Sure.
I would consider gasoline sustainable if I thought that within the next 1,000 years we wouldn't have to care about global warming or actual effects of.
So I guess one tricky thing for me is like it's hard to anticipate the way that you boost up a society with an unsustainable resource and it's able to come up with like the next use of resource or like the next technological advance that can clean up the problem of the you know what I mean? Like that seems like actually the way that things more optimistically can go. It's not that we can come up with one thing now that will like last 1,000 years, but we can come up with the next 50 years or 100 years.
Well, that's why it gives
and then come up with the
the next thing.
But it seems like too long a time frame for me, I guess, in terms of the speed of technology and so on too.
Yeah, I mean,
if we could, that'd be great. But I guess I'm not as pessimistic if we can't, that we won't come up with the next thing.
I mean, I think maybe what you're saying is that sometimes it's hard to know what's sustainable because we don't know what kind of innovations we're going to have.
I guess,
and if we try, and if we're too conservative, then we might not do something that actually would have been sustainable and would have benefited.
Or would have benefited in the sense that this is like kind of a crude example, but let's imagine at first we only know how to like burn wood for fuel or like whatever, but then we figure out like atomic energy and solar energy. But if we hadn't burned any wood for fuel, we never would have been able to build an infrastructure to build solar or atomic or solar energy in the first place. And so we couldn't burn wood for 1,000 years, but we can burn wood until we get to the point of solar energy
but when we started
atomic energy
burning wood, we didn't know.
But we didn't know that when we started. So how do you make those decisions isn't so obvious to me. You see what I mean? Like even if you can project that.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes, and so I mean, this is a peeve I have with the way political discussion works in this country a lot of the time. We frame our discussion around how can we enjoy the economy we have now and maybe be a little greener. And what I feel like, to me, that just seems so backwards. If what you're talking about really is environmental collapse, if the thing that you're afraid of really is like rendering areas not human habitable,
Right.
Well,
It depends on
Easter
the
Island.
That would be an example. I mean, it's habitable, but there's not wood there, which is a problem. But if the discussion really is about how do we make the world not drive us extinct, literally anything is justified. Like it
No, I understand. It depends on the risk
how
of
do
the
we
outcome.
keep the economy we have now while being green. It should be a matter of how do we not go extinct while enjoying as much economy as we can within that framework of not going extinct.
Yeah, I understand. It depends on how you weight like the different errors and how big they
And
are.
I think there are some things that are obvious forms of waste. For example, if we are, example I always use, if we're making up work for people to do that otherwise doesn't need to be done, and then they're commuting to their jobs every day, causing emissions and using up resources that wouldn't necessarily need to be used up and that kind of thing, we know that that's wasteful. That's not going to lead to the development of a new technology or something like that. Like that's not bleeding edge anything. So I think there are. I don't know if we would get to a point where there's something that's like using a lot of resources, but also like leading to a lot of discoveries and progress that we would really decide to shut down, or leading to a lot of benefit that we would decide to shut down. Yeah.
Do you consider idle labor time a resource in that calculation?
So I think if you are forcing people to do something, to spend their time in a way that is not useful, you are wasting human potential.
Right. It should be done useful, but like. If this, I understand that if the scenarios we're comparing are like somebody who's doing something productive versus somebody who's doing something unproductive, obviously you want the productive one. But if it's somebody doing something slightly productive versus somebody watching TV for 3 hours or something, like...
Well, you can't know the counterfactual, of what someone would be doing. So if you're paying someone to dig holes and fill them back in again, there's no chance that they're going to discover the next, scientific breakthrough or something like that. If you let people spend their time how they choose, some people might watch television, play video games, do drugs. Some people might come up with an amazing innovation while they are watching television, playing video games, and doing drugs. You don't know, right?
And everybody's kids are going to have more time with their parents and mundane things like that.
I mean, yeah, it's a matter of giving people freedom, and there's a lot of variation there. And if you're saying like, oh, well, these people are definitely wasting their time, therefore we should force everyone to, kind of do this bare minimum of work that isn't necessarily necessary for the economy, then you're taking away these kind of outlier opportunities of like, things that you couldn't have predicted. You never would have thought to pay for, but someone did because they had freedom to do what they wanted.
So idle time is considered waste, but you don't think we can be sure if somebody is truly being idle or not?
Yeah.
I think, right. I would say that the waste is in forcing people to be idle, but giving them a choice means there's an opportunity for something.
If that opportunity is squandered, it would still be waste, or like if.
That's why it's calling it an opportunity, though, right? Like you don't if you let people do their own thing, they might
Right.
do
No,
something.
I'm just refining his definition of waste.
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
I wouldn't say that giving people freedom and they're sitting around playing Xbox and smoking pot, I wouldn't say that that's waste. At least not in the way I'm framing it right now. Maybe there's something you could do to inspire them or something like that, but it would be less about...
But like
It's worse.
Purely from an economic perspective, it sounds like we're describing a resource, human labor, which is available and not being used.
Yeah, like it's strictly bad from an economic perspective to waste human labor as an excuse to give them money.
Right. So there's kind of three things we expect from the labor market. We expect efficient allocation of the resource of labor. We expect consumers to receive income, and we expect workers to kind of get derive meaning and purpose in their lives. And then the question is, how much of the first one do we want to sacrifice? How much efficient allocation of labor do we want to sacrifice in order to get people money and kind of provide people meaning and purpose? And obviously, if you have a basic income that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy, so everyone's kind of spending at optimal levels, you don't need the second thing from the labor market. And then the third thing, there are lots of things that can provide people meaning and purpose. Is the answer for everyone to make up work for them to do. If we need people to work, the labor market can incentivize people to work through wages.
I think where we have a disagreement is your idea of needing work versus making up work. I feel like, to me, there's like a gradient there. there's work that absolutely must be done so that we don't all die. Somebody needs to grow our food.
Yeah.
Somebody
Sure.
needs to keep people healthy. Whatever, right?
Right.
And then
The
there's
practical
work that's
way-
kind of nice to have.
Yeah, the practical way that Alex thinks about this is like, if one of your goals, and this becomes like sort of a practical instantiation thing, but if one of your goals is to create jobs or something like that, you're introducing inefficiencies
Right,
most
right.
likely. If you're, there's still going to be
I
debates
agree with
over
the
what to pay
argument
for.
against- I
Yeah.
agree with the
If
argument
you're-
against the whole job
Right,
creation
right.
rhetoric.
If you want to create infrastructure and you're the government and you have things you want to spend money on that would benefit society, then yeah, that might be a good idea to pay for those things. But no matter what you're doing, you kind of want to do it using resources as efficiently as possible, and that includes labor. So you don't want to use any more labor than necessary and that kind of
But
thing.
like, if you were running a country, sorry, am I taking up too much time?
No, go ahead. That's okay. That's what this is for.
If you were running a country,
Yeah.
and you tallied your labor pool and you realized that you had 6 million man hours of labor every month that was just not being used, or at least
Yeah.
not being used in a way that you could record.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you want to see like, okay, well, what's a stretch goal I could try to hit with that extra? I'm generating more power than I can use. What can I plug into that power?
No, I wouldn't want to do that.
You just need to incentivize people with enough money so that they want to use up those 6 million man hours.
But it's not clear like what using those person hours like is effective for, because a lot of great art comes out of people who have patrons, like people who don't have to do any other kind of
Yeah.
work. And so like how do you decide what those
Absolutely,
unused
yeah.
person hours are? Like if someone's like, I'm just like doodling and like learning how to paint, like we say like, oh well that could be valuable, but like if you're like playing a video game, like we've decided that's too far out, like that doesn't count as productively using your person hours.
Yeah, I think most of the greatest innovations in human history have come out of stuff that nobody ever would have thought to pay for. It's by and large kind of coming from the aristocracy, coming from rich people, that kind of thing. And, there are plenty of rich people who don't do anything useful, don't contribute anything useful to society, and those just aren't the ones we remember. But they all had an opportunity to.
It sounds like giving everybody. And I'm not suggesting that we actually like order everybody around every hour of the day. That would be horrifying.
Yeah.
But just as a framing device, like it sounds like the method of we'll let 1,000 people be idle rich, and maybe 3 of them will be the next Descartes.
Yeah.
That sounds very, very inefficient to me. Versus like, okay, you 100 people go try to be Descartes. Hopefully, some of you will make it.
But I think
But we
Alex's-
don't know what that means, right? Like nobody could say you go try to be Descartes. Like we don't know what the next Descartes is, right? Like we can't
can
define
like
that.
give scientists research grants to be professional scientists without them sitting around their home being inspired by something. And generally, scientists under that model do produce things. We have an economy that demonstrates that.
But then it basically kind of like enables more people to do that potentially. That like you can, I mean, is your concern like how do we like fund like science grants? Because this way like people can just be
that
like,
was his concern.
Are you worried that if you just gave those people the money and didn't tell them that they had to be scientists, that they wouldn't do the same breakthroughs? If you just gave them the resources without the conditions that...
I think, let me try to put this in economic terms and
Yeah.
see if I can sort of justify myself here.
Yeah.
I think this becomes a tragedy of the commons issue. I think everybody has a sort of general unified goal that we want, because we're talking about science, I'll go with science. Everyone has a unified goal that we want science to be done.
Yeah.
We generally think that increases people's quality of life, at least I do.
Sure.
But I would argue for a lot of people, and there are definitely people who will go into that just of their own accord because that's what they love to do.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, they might kind of like science. They might not necessarily protest being scientists, but given their free time and not necessarily any extrinsic motivation, might not do it. And I think that number of people is large enough that just leaving everybody strictly to their own freedoms is a very inefficient way of getting that done.
Well, so here's another question, and this is related to something I bring up a lot, which is that who do you want to be in your workforce? Do you want the people who really don't want to be there doing that job, who would rather be at home playing Xbox and smoking pot, or do you want the people who kind of want to be working and want to be contributing? And I think that's true of scientists too. So I mean, I think it makes sense to devote resources to science. There are certain things that you can't
science
do.
that might not be a great example.
Yeah.
Let's like, what's a dirty menial job? Like if we had, we need somebody to go unclog the sewers.
But I
under
think
the
most
city.
of those are easy because, like, he would just say, like, you need the sewers unclogged. Try to get it done with the minimal labor
But
possible.
there already
Okay.
there's a robot that's sort of already, inspecting and cleaning the sewers.
So that's
purely
cool.
hypothetical.
But I mean,
like you can still pay people,
Right,
Like,
right,
I mean,
yeah.
Alex's framework doesn't like you. If you need the sewers cleaned, like Alex would say, like so you just pay like
you pay someone to do the sewers.
yeah, and you're like, okay, maybe it takes like $1 million to get someone to like clean
Well,
the
okay,
sewers. Okay.
Let's say it wasn't strictly necessary, but was unpleasant, but had some large positive externality. Like,
So
perhaps you don't need to clean the sewers every month, but things run nicer if you do.
So I
Alex
mean, I
doesn't
think
have
you-
any trouble paying for any of
Yeah,
that. I think there might be
you'd
like
still
a
want to pay
misunderstanding.
for the things you want to pay for, and if it takes labor, it takes labor, and that's fine. You wouldn't be doing it for the purpose of giving the person a job.
Right.
Yeah.
We're
I think we
agreed on
agree.
that.
I think
Yeah.
it only gets confusing with something like science funding, actually, because it's like not really clear like what the cap on that is. Like, how much should you fund science, like versus
Right.
let people like kind of do their own thing? That actually is kind of like an interesting question. I think it's kind of on the margin of your approach because it's like it's not just like the sewers where like at a certain point you don't need anyone else to like clean the sewers.
I'm not
yeah.
suggesting making up work strictly for the sake of telling people they have something to do.
Right.
I'm suggesting perhaps there is a benefit in looking at the amount, like the labor volume of your country, and trying to fill some proportion of it that you think is reasonable, such that you are using as much of that output as possible.
I think there's a value in like, as you said, like having stretch goals and having kinds of things that you want to accomplish, and then saying, okay, what are the resources we would need to accomplish those things? And then if you have those resources, you can employ those resources.
So, I think of this as a labor efficiency thing. The most efficient use of labor in the world is I have something that I need done soon, that you can do, you do it, right? And the least efficient labor in the world is just nobody's doing labor. And there's kind of a gradient in between of maybe there's something that doesn't need to be done but should be done, and if you're available, you should do it. And I recognize that's less efficient than doing something that needs to be done, but we're out of things that need to be done.
Right. So the way I like to think about it is, if we're imagining an efficient labor market where labor is being used as efficiently as possible, we have some things that really need to be done that are like the critical things that you're talking about. Some things maybe not as much, but they're still being paid for. And what the role of wages would be, the only role of wages would be to incentivize people to do things other than how they'd ordinarily be spending their time. So that could either be the market, businesses.
We're not talking about the workers' incentive to do it right now. I think we're talking about the government's incentive to declare the work something that needs to be done in the first place.
Well, the work,
not the government, but
it's
industry,
both. How do you get the
it's
worker to
government.
do it? You have to have the incentive, right?
Right, but like
I
if
think
the
he's still
government's
saying like how do you
declaring-
decide how much like I don't know science funding to have? Would you take into account how many people are already doing other things?
the original disagreement that
Yeah.
I think we had was, from my perspective, if I was running the country and I saw we had some very large manpower surplus, I would try to find something productive to put at least some part of that towards that I thought was like humane and not going to make people miserable.
Right.
I mean, I can see a practical angle here, where, like with science, because you can have like an infinite amount of it. Where if like nobody had any time anyway, you might be like, okay, I'm not gonna like pay a huge wage for science just to like pull people out of like manufacturing or whatever else they need to do. But if you had like a huge number of people hanging out and you're automated just about everything else, I could see like that influencing my decision as a government to put more money into science, because like you're not going to need to put as much to incentivize people, and
Yeah.
or maybe you just have a fixed amount and it would just incentivize different numbers in those two situations.
A question can be, what is science? If you're paying people to do science, what are you paying them to do? Are you paying them to be academics?
That's
to learn,
purely an
or-
example. Like I don't want to be tied
Yeah.
to science here. I'm just talking about like.
I mean, I think
I like
these
that.
arguments can kind of
Right.
apply to anything we
Well,
talk
I guess
about.
why I like science or things like it is like
Yeah.
the other ones are easier for me to see because there's like I said, like a set amount that you want to fund, and then you kind of don't need to fund that thing anymore. But like
Not
you
necessarily,
can kind of
like-
infinitely fund like the arts or science or like lead people in those directions.
Even production, like I might have, maybe I need 50,000 nails produced, and I want a 10,000 nail surplus in case next year we don't produce as much for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But I'm better off with the 20,000 nail surplus than a 10,000 nail surplus within reason, right?
But I guess then
that would be a
the
private
market would
business
handle
usually.
that, yeah.
So you would be making calculations based on what's most profitable to you. So if you're calculating that paying for a 20,000 nail surplus right now is going to maximize your profit or maybe reduce your risk in the next.
I'm not talking about like who's organizing it. I'm just talking like from a theoretical perspective, whether or not it's work that should be done. I thought the disagreement we had was you were saying once we've met the needs of the society, we don't really need to allocate more work. People should kind of be free to decide what they want.
No, I would say that it's not useful to even define what the needs of the society are, because as you said, it's like a gradient. You know, some things you would say like, oh yeah, people definitely need that, but then there's stuff in between, and it's not about, you know, like drawing a hard line and saying, okay, the needs of the society have been met. It's about what is our potential, right? So basic income funds the market. It gives consumers money to spend, so that, you know, helps maximize the productive potential of the private market economy. But not everything can be provided by the private market economy, you know, because of tragedy of the commons, and, you know, the collective interest needs to be represented somehow. So then you'd have spending by the government or whoever's representing the collective interest, and they would be using up some resources too. So then there's interesting questions for how do we balance the spending between the two things, and I don't think there's any one right answer to that, and, you know, that's something that can be debated. Right? Does that make sense?
So I think it's less limited than what you were thinking you were saying.
Right.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, you know, basic income, you know, it's not a specific prescribed amount, and if you're deciding that the government wants to use more resources for science or whatever ends, that means maybe the amount of basic income you can afford is smaller, but you're making that trade-off, and, you know, there's reasonable arguments to be made for why the government should be using more resources and the market should be using less resources and that kind of thing. Yeah. And of course that changes the incentives, right? If your people have less of a basic income, they maybe have more of an incentive to find another source of money.
Are there scenarios where you could envision it being a positive? I can't believe I'm going to make this argument.
Yeah.
Are there scenarios where you can envision it would be a positive thing for the government to reduce basic income specifically so that they can motivate more people to work?
So I would say not just for the specific purpose of motivating people to work, but maybe if there were specific resources or specific things that they needed to build, right? And then that would be part of it. But you wouldn't just be looking at labor and saying, I want to activate that labor arbitrarily. I think that would be like looking at, oh, we found this oil. I want to figure out a way to burn it, even if I don't have something to use it for, or something like that.
Well, but it is a little different. Like the oil will still be there if you don't burn it. In fact, that's the benefit of having oil.
Because the oil can be stored, yeah.
The human labor is time. It by definition slips away. Like, the concern here is that like it sounds like it is a 0% efficient use of their labor if they're not laboring.
Well, then so I mean, there's labor in terms of the labor market, and then there's work in terms of effort that people put in and useful things that people do with their time, and those things are not necessarily the same thing. Like, just because you're not being paid doesn't mean you're not doing something useful.
Absolutely, and I agree that a lot of
there's no way to really
things are done.
Measure how much work people are doing accurately. Yeah, Pablo.
Yeah, I mean, if you have jobs which can be automated, there's, like, as you mentioned, like human resources, like something which can perish. But if you have an economy which is highly automated, I mean, there's actually you're at a competitive advantage to use the automation versus using labor. Like, you're losing money on the table if you use labor.
Absolutely, but in that case, like, I'm not even like strongly advocating that every man hour be used, but at some level, if there's a massive surplus, even if there is automation, great, let's use automation and find something else that we don't have an easy way of automating to throw that labor at.
I guess there's like a bar that you might want to have, like Alex was saying, for many reasons, like to letting people choose how they use their time, and one of them is human freedom, but another one is that humans might actually be better than you as the planner at like figuring out an efficient way to use their time in some sense, because people are going to spend it on things that they're good at, or going to spend it on things that are,
like, you know. The tragedy of the commons.
There are tragedies of the commons, but Alex would say, or I would say, like, pay for the solving of those things directly, as opposed to saying like human laborers out there.
No,
Like,
no,
what are you
I
kind of
don't
thinking
think
about?
tragedy
where
of
we-
the commons in the sense of like a public project that needs, or I mean tragedy of the commons in the sense of like, if we view the total supply of manpower in the country as a public good, it is in your individual interest to not activate that. Like it might be
Right.
enjoyable to you.
No,
as
I
an
understand what you're
individual
saying.
To not do that.
I understand, but I guess
But it's better for the
I'm
society
saying
if
there's
you go
some
and do
bar
something.
that you have to clear that you're confident you're using that labor better than whatever the natural kind of rhythm is.
Right. You're confident that you'd be getting people to spend their time in a way that's, on average, more beneficial than how they.
And I think it's more of a mix than a pure tragedy of the
Yeah.
commons, how people spontaneously use their time, because some of it's caring for their kids, which maybe isn't the most effective, isn't the least effective. Some of it's doing creative things, some of it's doing invention things, because there's other motives like prestige motives that can sometimes align with like social with.
Absolutely.
So
There's plenty of work that goes.
all I'm
into
saying
this
is like
country.
there's some bar to clear that you as a central planner actually have a task that's better
Right.
than what people are doing spontaneously.
I would say that the way I think about it is that by default, we can give people freedom to spend their time how they choose and enough money to, activate the full productive capacity of the economy. Like that's kind of the default, unless you have a reason to pay for something else. If you have a reason to pay for a military or build transportation infrastructure or whatever the society needs that the markets won't pay for on their own, then you pay for that stuff. But it should always be, are we sure that this is better than what?
And let
than
me
what
add
people
one
do
more
on
thing
their
to that.
own?
Like, if
Yeah.
your ultimate goal with all of these things is like the well-being of your society, obviously you're getting a direct input to that by letting people choose what they do with their time in the first place. So to take that away in order to get some other benefits
Right.
socially, there's already that bar
People
to
vote
clear.
with their dollars based on what they
Or their
It's also
time,
like
yeah.
time, yeah.
a lot of it can be like present versus future. So like
Yeah.
uh,
Like, there's lots of stuff
it
I
could
would,
be, it
yeah.
could be that making people work is beneficial for everybody in the next 5,000 years, and letting them be idle is beneficial for everybody today.
It's hard to make that trade-off, I guess, yeah.
If you want to force people to work, or if you want to incentivize people to spend their time doing something that they ordinarily wouldn't be doing, you have to have some kind of reason to do that. I think it's kind of backwards to say, oh, this person isn't working, let's come up with something for them to do.
I think you guys agree. I don't
I think
really
we
know where
mostly
the
agree.
disagreement.
I
Maybe
think
I'm
we
missing.
probably agree politically, but not ideologically on this.
That
Maybe.
might be,
go ahead,
yeah,
Richard.
that might be.
Well, Buckminster Fuller said that one person can come up with something they can provide for 10,000 people, and there's an example in The West Wing of the President Barton's daughter, who's a researcher, and she's like, these people were doing PHP or whatever it is, PCP is it, and they had some sort of brain deficiency or something, and that led researchers to come up with a cure for some sort of disease. So people doing destructive things to themselves in their private time
Yeah.
positive things for society.
It really is hard to know what's going to lead to what. Like, we can
Yeah.
know that certain things we need to pay for.
And
like
can we
infrastructure.
more or less agree that people doing drugs isn't a good research program for a country? Even if once in a while lightning strikes twice, you get lucky.
I mean, it depends. I mean, if people are, ultimately we care about people's well-being. If those people are better off doing that, then it's hard to say that it's a
Well,
problem.
maybe those people are better off doing that, but you're like, I guess I'm trying to put like the long-term collective interest over the short-term individual interest.
Sure. So then the question is, what do you want to prepare for? And jobs take up resources. So that's a cost to our future as well. If you don't have something that's going to benefit the future, I don't know. It's hard to say. And
I guess what do you mean jobs take up resources?
Like, people commute, people use resources at their job, people do all these different
Like,
kinds
okay,
of things.
there's all
in
kinds of
practice,
industries
yes,
that maybe
in
shouldn't
theory,
even
not
exist.
necessarily. That's just
Depends on what
But,
kind of
but even
job.
people's time is a resource.
Right.
Right.
But that's going to be spent anyway. Like people's time goes
Well,
away at the rate of 1 second
but-
per
so-
second, no matter
Right,
what.
but they
you-
get to use it in different ways, and so if we want like a future where everyone gets to fully actualize themselves, aren't we like helping to build that future by letting people do what they want and figuring out how to incentivize the other stuff to be like, okay, well, we definitely need roads, and we need like teachers, and we need like
Yeah.
child caregivers, and so figuring out how to align all those incentives, but being like, okay, if people have free time and we're getting all the, like, if we're getting all the stuff that we want done, which I guess is just really another way of saying you're like, unless you have specific projects.
Right, yeah.
Right. Like if you had a specific thing in mind where you're like, okay, if people do this thing, like banking all the seeds or something, then like people 5,000 years from now are going to be so much better off. Like that's one thing. And then I guess the other question is like, how confident do you have to be, and how do you weigh like the uncertainty and the risk when you're coming up with these projects that take up people's time?
Right. So then there's also the question of
That might have been, you might have something much better than that.
there's the question of the future benefiting from all of humanity's potential innovation and ingenuity and creativity that we don't know where it's going to come from or what it's going to look like. And anytime you're allocating labor towards something specific, you're taking something away from that potential. It's really hard to know what contribution people are going to make if you leave
I
them
guess
to their own
what I'm
devices.
suggesting is that all of those things are labor, and I would just as soon allocate that. Like, and I'm not even talking about like having a big central planner come in and tell you to do it. I'm just saying like if I see that you're of your own volition spending 6 hours a day researching, I don't know, cancer cures or whatever, I'm probably not going to try to find something for you to do because I feel like maybe you're doing something productive. If I see that you're spending 8 hours a day mostly doing nothing, not having anything to do, I might try to say like, oh, hey, you want a job, I don't know, putting up fences because we're building a new community here, which I don't know.
If you need to put up some fences and you're looking for people
it's
to
a bad example because now we're back to me.
No, it doesn't have to be neat. If you want people to put up fences, like if you're hoping to get this fence put up and you're looking for people to do that.
I don't need a bed of flowers in my garden, but it would be nice if I had one.
Right. When I say need, I'm not talking about like it's like like a deep need that if it doesn't happen, something terrible will happen. I'm just saying like if you have demand for it. Yeah. If you have demand for a fence and you're looking for someone to build that fence, I think you'd probably have some pretty good luck if you go around to the people who don't look like they have anything else to do. But you don't know what's going on in that guy's head, what he's thinking about. So I played World of Warcraft for 5.5 months, right? That's all I was doing for 5.5 months. And my concern is that if we had a system where it was trying to get everyone to have a job or work or something like that, that would have prevented me from doing that. And that was an important part of my development as a full human person adult. And if I hadn't had that, I don't know where I'd be today if I'd be doing the amazing things that I'm doing now. So I'm kind of concerned because there's we can't. It's really hard to look at someone and make a judgment about whether they're spending their time in a useful way.
They could be like getting in touch with deep inner silence that they're going to go share.
Maybe they're meditating
with everybody.
You say about your 5 months. You say I can't predict like the value of somebody's idle time. Can you honestly predict the value of what you would have produced or become or whatever else?
And that's
done something.
That's the other thing. I mean, if you go to people and ask them whether they're doing anything useful, they might not be able to give you an answer that has the information that you need to go on it. Someone could think they're wasting their time, but that doesn't. Obviously you want people to be happy, and
I guess is the claim here on it like.
Yeah.
This is what I'm not getting my head around. Is the claim here honestly that you think that statistically people are more productive doing things which we wouldn't visibly see any output of?
Yeah.
Than they are doing things which we think of as having an output.
Yes. For the most part, yes. Because when I talk about
think we get more research.
Well, like
done
compared
with
to
10,000
what?
people.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, the question is compared to what? There are certain vital things that we need doing, but
okay,
then...
Let me rephrase it this way. Do you think we get more research done with 10,000 people watching TV or with 10,000 people on paid research grants being told to research a particular problem? Which of these two models do you suppose produces more scientific results?
Is it the same people?
Yeah.
I think if you picked 10,000 people who wanted to spend their time watching TV...
10,000 totally random people... Who wanted? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's actually on Sunday there was on last week tonight there's a program in England about people watching television and how their responses during the program and how like they were showing about Brexit in how they were,
I think I saw that again.
in how their opinions were actually very valid about what's going to happen in the next, like back in, what was it? Right before they did the
2017.
no, the 2016 vote for Brexit, they people were saying, I don't know anything about what's going to happen about this, and then John Oliver says, well, what if there was a body that was supposed to know about these things, and we paid them and we elected them to do it, but they're just passing the buck to these people who don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah, Pablo, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned research. Like, I don't think so. All research is productive. Like, let's say, you know.
Absolutely not. It's a very inefficient process.
Yes, like we have, let's say, someone in the computer industry. You know, the Moore's law. Like, you know, the processors are getting faster every 24 months. But I mean, if you ask someone who's using a normal smartphone, do you really need 8 gigs of RAM just to watch, like, you know, do stuff on Instagram? Do you really need that, you know, innovation?
Careful. So back in the day,
Yeah,
Bill Gates once famously said that he didn't think anyone needed more than 10 megabytes.
640K.
640K, you're right.
Yeah.
Wait.
You know, people would just find more ways to use that RAM. But again, like, if I don't know if it's valid research that we should spend more time, you know, finding research for consumer products. Like, you know, you may not need that product in certain way. For example, do we need that much amount of RAM? Like,
Do we need lights in this building?
So-
do we need air conditioning?
Lights, yeah, but
Probably
then
So-
not,
talking
but I
about-
like them.
I think it's good to pay for scientific research. I think you want to provide opportunities for the people who are going to be excited to do the scientific research. So I wouldn't say that if you picked 10,000 random people and made them scientific researchers, that would be as efficient as, you know, providing opportunities so that whoever wanted to be a scientific researcher,
Well,
you know, there's
But we're talking
jobs
about the same
available.
10,000 people in both cases. That's the important part here. Like, I'm assuming the people who want to be scientists are already in our labor pool as scientists, and we don't
No.
see them as having idle time because they're not idle. Because
No,
they're
there are
doing
plenty of
research.
people who
In
do
his
not have the freedom.
hypothetical.
Oh, in your hypothetical world, all the people who want to be scientists are scientists.
So, like, I think this gets to, like, the question of, like, if you're the government, because the market is kind of its own thing and it handles supply and demand in its own way, but if you're the
Right.
government, you're actually trying to make a decision about how much free time you want to incentivize away from people to do science. It seems like it's really that very
Right.
specific kind of case where this, like, trade-off comes up. That is kind of like an interesting trade-off.
Right.
Because, you know, some people might, like, for enough money become a scientist, and if you don't offer that money, they won't. And
Right. And certainly you would say, okay, how much, you know, money do I have to spend to get people to be scientists, and how many resources do I have to use up and take away from the private economy, and you'd be making trade-offs like that.
I mean, imagine it was a very small amount of money. Like, I think the dispute I had earlier was I
Yeah.
thought you were saying that their time was better spent not having some particular thing that they're
I think there's
being
some
motivated
debate
to do
on
that between you guys.
than
Yeah.
having.
Yeah, I mean, I think by default, unless you have like a really good reason to incentivize someone to do something else.
But,
with
like,
their time.
science is a good reason, so that seems like a good case to kind of weigh these against each other.
Right, I'm saying there's a trade-off there, but it's not about looking at the amount of labor per se. It's about
That's
Yeah.
our whole dispute, right?
Yeah.
Right? I think at least in some degree, like labor is a thing that you have that expires, and I would just as soon use it before it expires.
I think-
if I have
I think-
meat in my fridge,
I
I'd
think
like to
free,
cook it
I
before
so I
it's
think
bad.
I think you're comparing two things that expire, right? Like people's free time and freedom and opportunity to create and innovate. That's something that expires. Two people expire, they die, and if you're using up their time, you have to ask yourself, am I really using it in a better way?
I'm like,
But I think you guys just disagree on
if
that.
somebody wants to create and innovate, then they can go do. I'm not going to try.
But they
to
don't
take
necessarily
time
know
away
that
from-
they're doing that, right?
Yeah, like, you wouldn't be able to affect specific individuals. You
Well,
just
then-
have to set a
then
policy.
Then there's part of our dispute is
Yeah.
I think doing something with intent of getting it done is a more efficient way of getting things done than not intending to get things done and happening on it by chance. I think most mathematicians who do interesting
but then
math are
there's-
professional mathematicians. I think most Not
Yeah, but
all,
it's hard to know who's going to be a professional mathematician, right? And if
But they're already in our labor pools. Like,
so here's what I imagine. I imagine, it's ancient Greece, and there's these, intellectuals who are coming up with all kinds of amazing stuff, and their work is being supported by slaves who are being forced not to do anything useful, or they're doing something useful, but it's something very specific. And then I imagine a world in which everybody is, in the position of those aristocrats, and the slaves are technology, right? And yeah, we have labor that's maybe going idle, and
it sounds like what you're telling me then is that if we have technology that obsoletes slave labor, then the economy runs more efficiently. I don't dispute that.
No, I think you guys just disagree on how useful in the long term it is to have people have control over their time. Yes. And I think Alex really does feel that it's more useful than you do, and I think that is kind of.
And I mean, I agree with you that there are times when we do want to pay for people to spend their time in specific ways. Maybe we disagree about where the line is.
And anyway. I think your own personal journey informs this too, because Alex has spent a lot of time following his interests, and it has led him in much more unconventional and interesting
or not knowing what I'm doing and not having a direction necessarily.
And I'm not suggesting that you haven't done something productive with that, just that maybe in a world where that was directed, it would have been more productive.
Yeah, but I see most people do way less interesting stuff than Alex who are much more directed. In my experience, most people who are directed are directed in a suboptimal way. And I see a lot of people who aren't directed
do way less interesting stuff.
So it
is a statistical thing, right? It's
But yeah, then you also weigh the output of
how many people doing nothing useful is worth one person doing something
how much is one
useful.
Darwin worth, right? Like Darwin who's independently wealthy and gets to hang out and do his own thing.
I think we can kind of know
things that his work was measurable. He went on a voyage and had all sorts of goals and objectives to it. It was pretty organized.
Sure, but there are plenty of people who are in his position who didn't do that, and part of what gave him the freedom to do that, the freedom to organize himself in that way, it was stuff that nobody would have paid a laborer to do, right?
So you need a system that's better at finding what's useful to pay laborers to do. That's an unrelated question.
Well, I mean that's what the market is, right? And the market is how you kind of it responds to demand based on what people want to buy.
I think what you've suggested is that the market is not efficient at allocating labor, which is a position I agree with.
I'm saying that it's not efficient at allocating labor because we keep making up jobs for people to do. It would be efficient if the only purpose of wages were to incentivize people to work, and it was nothing about they needed a certain amount of income or anything like that. Then the only reason jobs would exist would be to incentivize labor because businesses thought it was profitable because their product was demanded, that kind of thing. And then you'd have an efficient allocation of labor.
But isn't there...
Andrew's... Oh, sorry. Just to point out that Andrew's also chiming in.
Yeah. So Andrew says, humans have evolved to specialize and oversized brains work to conserve energy. The problem I see we have is a basic fitness models of need, i.e. need to run on a treadmill to increase my well-being, so we're advised to run and exercise. So how is this different than creating jobs for well-being so long as it's not creating waste? So I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think, we do want to spend resources helping people find a meaning in their lives. And maybe for some people that means making up useless things for them to do.
It sounds like he's talking, you said you had your three sort of things.
Yeah, the third one.
Right. It sounds like you're talking about the third one here.
Right. And, some people, maybe it's playing sports, maybe it's other kinds of entertainment and that kind of thing. And obviously, while you're spending time doing those activities, you might not be producing anything, but ultimately...
people create artificial AI to defeat the world's best Dota players. That actually lead to something.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of weird hobbies and stuff that people come up with that could be useless. Some things are obviously useless and some things aren't. Some things that are obviously useless turn out not to be useless in the end.
And like I said, if people are happy in the meantime, that is an input to what you care about in the long, in your
right. We care about people's well-being now, and we care about future humanity's well-being, and that's why we care about not exceeding our capacity and making the world worse for future generations, which gets us back to economic growth.
I see what you did there.
Let's go to another quote. Economists raised in this period of plenty assume that growth is good, necessary even, and should continue forever and ever without end. Amen. Growth delivers jobs, returns on investment, and higher tax revenues.
Ooh.
What's not to like?
You don't like any of those
I
things.
don't like any of those three things. I mean, return on investment is fine, but that's not, the economy is for, how does it benefit people? So, tax revenues, I mean, you guys know how I feel about tax revenues.
It's a whole separate
I don't
thing.
think they
But it's fascinating.
anything.
It's fascinating to me, though, even that they don't list anything tangibly well-being related here.
Right.
Growth also means potentially more people with food, and also more people with interesting things like iPhones or whatever. And none of that is represented here in jobs, returns on investment, or
Right.
higher tax revenues.
Yeah.
Not directly, anyway. It might be indirect.
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
go ahead.
Some of this is more definitional than anything. Like when I hear the word economy, I feel like economy is like our power to do things. Our power to do things doesn't say anything about what we do with that power. It sounds like we're almost conflating our ability
But
to
you
give
wouldn't have to have
everyone-
higher tax revenues either. That's only indirect with respect
Well,
to
you
a
could have
policy
a-
decision or something.
Right. I'm not necessarily agreeing with that. I'm just,
Yeah.
go ahead, Richard.
What was the returns on investment? The government funds basic research, and most of the components of an iPhone, like 90% or something like that, are based on basic
Right.
research funded by the government.
Yeah, so I agree with what Bethany was saying.
It's interesting.
It is interesting, and when we talk about the economy, like Jared was saying, what are we talking about? I think there's the actual level of production, which we kind of think of as GDP, and then there's also the potential production, and I think you were talking more about the potential there, and I think what they're talking about here is the actual level of economic activity, which they associate with production. So I think there is a difference there, and I think sometimes we can have growth just because we're activating untapped productive capacity, untapped economic potential. I think that can be growth too.
Yeah, but I'm going to compare a firm. So let's say, you're producing something, and you know that you're going to reach a point where producing anything more is going to be, you're going to reach a point of diminishing return.
Yeah.
Now, you have two options over there. Either you, stay at that level, or you expand, and then, you again work to achieve that level again. So it's a continuous process.
Right.
So, I think the same should apply for, economy. They're going to reach a point where they're satisfying needs at an efficient level. But now, producing any more than that point is going to be, you're going to start losing out on that. The opportunity cost would be too high. So, I think we're seeing the same problem in China. They're doing so much construction, which is, I think it's sort of unusual for GDP to grow so fast with just infrastructure, construction. Most high developed economies are on the services scale, while China is still manufacturing. And now they're doing more manufacturing, so whereas they should have moved to services. So I guess that's one question, where should you stop?
Yeah, and I think that question gets lost when you just look at a number like GDP, and in looking at what's the benefit for consumers, how are consumers benefiting from the economy, that helps us get closer to an answer. So if you're building houses that nobody lives in, if you're building a city that nobody lives in, then who's benefiting from that?
Exactly.
That's not, if I were measuring the size of the economy, I would be thinking about how are consumers actually benefiting from stuff. If you are producing a city that nobody lives in, that's very similar to digging a hole and filling it back in again. So I would not include that in my measure of the size of the economy. I don't think I think you've got a little bit of Goodhart's law going on here. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. That kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
So I think this ties back a little bit to our discussion last week.
Yeah.
This to me seems like it's almost true contingent on the fact that we stay within a rigidly capitalistic structure without something like UBI. That is, I think it is true that in order for people's quality of life to stay the same, the total size of the economy probably needs to keep growing the way it is structured now. Because I think the way the economy is structured now, wealth tends to pool in places, and it tends to go from...
Oh, so like as a way to replace that money, people need to have jobs, like more and more jobs down below.
Income inequality tends to grow over time.
Right, of course, yeah.
Which is only not a catastrophe for you if the total size of the economy is expanding to meet that.
I see what you're saying.
So capitalism almost forces this to be
So when you're talking about the size of the economy, what do you mean when you say? So let's say rich people are accumulating a lot of money, they're not necessarily spending that money on a lot of extra production because they're kind of just hoarding the money or investing in financial instruments.
Some are, but yeah.
But to the extent, like, it's not like if you have
a much smaller percentage of their income is spent. Yes.
Yeah, if you have 10 million times as much money, you're not using up 10 million times as much resources, even though you might be showing off and dumping $10,000 bottles of champagne down the sink and stuff like that, which actually doesn't take up that many resources. It just costs a lot of money.
Keep on going with that one. Just do that.
There are ways for rich people to waste money that are very not wasteful of resources, and I think we should encourage the rich people to waste their money in those ways. But the question is,
well, if they're ethical,
is economic growth really necessary in the current system for people to maintain their standard of living? Yeah.
I think there's a distinction between like economic growth and economic development.
Yeah.
So I think the ideal goal is like the economy like grows to a certain extent and then it tends to focus on development. Development would be like, you're improving your social scores. So then again, there's a debate like who do we say is more economy developed, let's say United States or Norway? Like who do you say is more rich? Now in absolute terms, United States has more money.
Right.
But then when you compare Norway, so they have a better living standard.
Right.
It's also per capita versus gross, right?
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of let's say, U.S. economy can do more. The government has more resources to create things, but then again, you go down to people. You look at the life expectancy, you look at the infant mortality and all that. You look healthcare. Now, United States, an average American spends more than probably any other citizen from any Western or industrialized country. But then again, on the return on their investment in terms of healthcare is less.
Right.
So I think you also have to put that into account. Like, how do you define development?
Yeah, totally. Like what?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and I think to the extent that spending is being funded by borrowing on top of borrowing, more and more borrowing, in order to be able to pay back that debt in the private economy, you're going to have some level of growth just to sustain.
Yeah, this is a little bit, I don't know if that's what you meant, but that was one of the things
that a little bit related to what you're talking about?
I wouldn't say borrowing is a matter of monetary policy. That's not quite related. Like the phenomenon I'm talking about is more related to what you were saying earlier about if you're making 10 million times as much money, you're not spending that much money.
Right.
Which means the amount of stuff in the economy is gravitating towards you in some way.
Or like at least...
Yes, like when you were talking about before with housing, they're going to produce $1 million apartments or whatever more than they're going to produce $10,000, $100,000 condos or whatever.
I'm not sure that's quite my point either, but
okay. So your point is that the people who have more spending power are going to be sucking up a higher proportion of the stuff. So in order to make up for the lost stuff, you need to be producing more for everyone else.
Yeah, so this comes from a framework where I believe that in general, power begets power in a way. If I have $100 million, I can spend some of it, but I'm not going to spend nearly all of it. I will probably invest some of it, and I will invest it with the expectation that I will make not only more money, but more money relative to inflation. I will control a larger percentage of the economy in the future than I do currently. That's just kind of the way people work. That's how
One thing that I always think about when talking to Alex is like to separate money and resources, both of which are important, but which Alex also separates.
That's an interesting thing. Like again, I'm sort of saying this is maybe true within the context of our current economy, where we very explicitly try to tie money to resources.
Yeah.
I would much rather an economy where we didn't have this, what I think of as an arbitrary barrier, which I think you think is an arbitrary, unnecessary barrier too.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say we do tie money to resources?
What I mean is like a very real thing that happens in our economy is we have both surplus housing and homeless people.
Yes.
And to a naive idealist like me, you would think these two problems ought to cancel each other out more or less.
Yes.
And they don't, and one of the reasons they don't is because we've structured our means of giving resources to people around this concept of money. Even if you don't actually own resources, owning a certain percentage of the money in the economy, albeit it's an abstraction, means that somebody else doesn't have that money, meaning that they don't have potentially some resource they need.
So when you're talking about growth, you're talking about growth in money, in the amount of money that's out there.
What I'm suggesting is that the percentage of the economy controlled by a handful of individuals increases over time.
What do you mean by controlled?
They can use it to bribe. They can use it to bribe politicians, and then
maybe, but that's another issue.
And then they can use it to expand their control over their copper industry or something, and then they can hoard all the copper and then have all the prices of copper go up. And
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's what monopolies. But I think that's a different issue. But as you mentioned, rich people are not spending that much, so then they're not using as many resources.
Right.
Like for example, when people say that when people compare developing nations and they're often slapping fines like UN organizations are always slapping fines in developing countries like India and China for contributing to pollution. But when you look at the carbon footprint per capita from Western countries and from developing countries, towards Asia and all, you see the resources are being more used by the Western countries versus the Indian ones. Like India, for example, is using less resources than the West.
Per capita.
Per capita, yeah. But as you mentioned, but in terms of the whatever you're saying, rich people using less resources, buying less stuff. They're hoarding money, but they're not buying stuff with it. So they're not controlling resources. They're just controlling money.
The unfortunate thing about our economy is we have monetary agencies whose job is to make sure that the percentage of the money you control more or less corresponds to the percentage of resources somebody else can't own.
Yeah, but can we say that rich people are controlling the economy because
that is in some sense the job of the Federal Reserve is to make sure that the money supply corresponds to the amount of stuff there is to buy on the market.
Well, their job is to make sure that the level of consumer spending or the flow of consumer spending aligns up with the amount of production in the economy such that prices stay stable, right?
Then maybe that should be their goal. That's not necessarily what they do.
Well, price stability is part of their mandate.
Yes, price stability is, but price stability doesn't have to do necessarily with consumer spending.
Well, they use a consumer price index.
Right, but like 10,000 homeless people who can't afford food aren't necessarily measured in that.
No, that has nothing to do with price
demand. Fair enough.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
All I was going to say is, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but it seems like there's a very relatively fast flow of money up and a much, much slower maybe like accumulation of resource use up. Because like per person, a wealthy person is using more resources,
right,
but not in proportion to their money. So like there's a much faster flow of the money up and then like a very slow, I guess I was trying to like think about that in terms of resources.
Like private jets or something.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Like a homeless person doesn't have a private jet, so
Well,
clearly
that's
there is
true.
a difference in resource use, but it's
I
much
think-
smaller. It's not per
Unless he
dollar.
lives on the jet.
The whole
Equivalent,
crime of this
yeah.
is we've based our resource allocation on this concept of money when you're right, they don't necessarily need more resources or use more resources.
I mean, I think they do, but it's slower than the accumulation of money. Is all I
Right.
was saying. Like the money is flowing much faster and like accumulating more, I guess, than that.
Well, and I'd argue one is linear and the other is exponential. Like,
I have to think about that.
your
but it
your
could
ability
be.
to make money in some sense depends on the money you have. That's the whole point of investment. If I invest and my investment is making, say, 2% interest over inflation,
Right,
I expect that to grow exponentially. That's my
Right.
entire incentive for investing.
right, yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. Money grows exponentially if you're investing. The amount of money you have, in terms of overall financial assets.
So an interesting point about economic growth that relates to both your point and Alex's general way of thinking is like what Alex was saying before about credit. So Alex often talks of, so how do you replace the money that's flowing up so that people can spend somewhat reasonably? And Alex would argue that like increasing the incentive to loan more money is one of the ways that happens.
Right. So the Fed.
One of the ways it happens, maybe not a very sustainable solution.
No, not a great
but-
solution. Like
It's
a very
not.
volatile
It leads
thing.
to bubbles and like credit collapses and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So this is the problem with monetary policy that the Fed does to keep prices stable is they incentivize more borrowing in the economy, and then that creates more brittleness in the credit markets and that kind of thing. But consumers do need spending money, and it is important for the economy to have a stable standard unit of value. It's important for prices to be pretty stable.
But Alex,
from
does that
day to
create
day.
an incentive for growth per se? The fact that they're like spending through this credit cycle,
I think,
they're getting money
yeah,
from
I mean, I
people
think
that
the
way?
fact that you're borrowing more and more means you need to do more to pay it back. So that can be through financial derivatives, which a lot of it is, and that contributes to the instability, but then it also can come from economic growth as well. So there is an
Right.
incentive, like that's the more stable way to do it is through economic growth, but you can't force the economy to grow that fast.
Right.
So you end up with the financial instability.
But it's also an incentive for economic growth that wouldn't be there with basic income necessarily, where things can just money flow can just be replaced.
Well, with basic income, you would actually have more consumers with spending power. So,
I mean, that might create economic growth.
yeah, I mean, it creates an incentive for producers to produce more rather than raise their prices when demand increases. If you have a flatter demand curve where the demand is more evenly distributed.
Well,
among
I think
consumers.
that's the beauty of UBIs.
Yeah.
In some sense, I'm witnessing I picture it almost as like pools of water. I'm witnessing what I think are reservoirs draining out water from
Right.
pools writ large, and UBI seems like a way of putting an absolute ceiling on the degree to which that effect can happen. You can own maybe as much as 98% of the economy, but as long as 2% of our economy is UBI, somebody else has money.
I don't know if I think about it that way. I usually think about it as like money is like a river flowing through the economy, and then what is the source of that flow? And if it's borrowing and growth of Wall Street or something like that, that's kind of unstable and unsustainable. Whereas if it's basic income, if people are
Right.
just getting money that doesn't have to be paid back,
It's a new source.
then that's a more stable source of money. So let's see, we got some comments on here.
Oh, cool.
Andrew says, rent-based economy perpetuates the continued need to work and consume by those that need to continue to pay into. So rich people are indirectly contributing to global waste. Not sure I understand that question.
Andrew, maybe you can add on to it if you're listening.
Yeah. I'm not sure what this means. I think he could be talking about if you are. I don't think this is what he's saying, but it's certainly true that if you're funding consumer spending through borrowing, and that can be either consumer borrowing directly, or it can be maybe businesses that wouldn't exist in an efficient economy are able to borrow because interest rates are so low, so they create jobs and that kind of thing, and that can contribute to global waste as well. Rent. So maybe he's saying that because people have to pay rent for various things like
I
okay.
mean that's my. I mean I don't know Andrews, but my guess. I'm like, oh, okay, like I parse it as like, so like because people have to pay rent, like they need jobs, and there's a lot of like consumption that comes out of that. So the rich, i.e., the landlord class, are indirectly contributing to global waste by being like, okay, we're forcing you all to pay rent. Like you need somewhere to live, and we're forcing you to pay us money for that. So then you have to have jobs, and there's all this consumption that goes.
So if you didn't need to constantly be paying for things, maybe you didn't need to be earning as much money, and then you wouldn't be spending your time earning money in ways that are potentially wasteful.
See, I interpreted rent a different way that has the same effect, which is if we were talking about a borrowing economy, I'm assuming you're paying interest on that. Otherwise, why am I risking my capital to
that's interesting.
finance you?
Right.
Yeah.
Elizabeth got it.
Excellent.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew, for clarifying.
Glad I can help.
So I think that's partly true, but it's also true that we can address this with the basic income, so people can use their basic income to pay the rent without necessarily addressing the rent itself.
That's true.
Yeah. And basic income, if we're talking about housing rent especially, basic income can create some incentives that help it come way down.
Alex has so many thoughts on so many things.
So many thoughts on so many things. So for housing, basic income improves quality of life in areas that are cheaper. So if you imagine that some people are indifferent today between living in expensive areas and cheaper areas, once you institute the basic income, that creates an incentive for people to, on net, migrate from the more expensive areas to the cheaper areas. So it would cause housing prices to come down in really expensive places like San Francisco, New York, that kind of thing.
So I'm not sure I follow why that incentive exists.
So you can imagine, say you're a person and you don't care whether you're living
So
in...
start with the assumption that, let's say, the basic income is the same across the country or across the world if it's global.
Right.
Right? And so the same amount of money, but you have different costs of living in different places.
So the amount of money is going to stretch further in Nashville than it does in New York City. So if you're indifferent between living in Nashville and New York City, you're more likely to move to Nashville now, because before you were on the fence.
Isn't that the same as it, like, right now I'm incentivized to live in a cheaper place.
Right, but now often people's incomes connect to the jobs, and a lot of the jobs are in the expensive places.
Are we
and
that
like,
I don't have a job? In addition
well,
to
so the
UBI,
basic income
or...
is not tied to a job. So like the effect of the basic income is to make prices even out, because the income you have is currently tied to the location in a way that the basic income is not.
Right. So you might still have
sense?
a job in Nashville, but now the job in Nashville is more appealing than it was before because you've got a basic income on top of that, and the basic income dollars stretch further than they would in New York.
So we're saying that you would have more incentive to move to a lower paying job if you didn't need a higher paying job to make ends meet.
Well, just on average, if you isolate the effect of the basic income, like so for example, a similar thing would be like anybody who can work remotely now, they don't have to live in any particular place. Like they might still have reasons to live in San Francisco, but on balance, like if they were indifferent, they might live in a cheaper place. This is a source of income that's like that. It's not tied to any particular place.
Right.
So all else being equal, it'll shift people.
If you've already calculated all the various complex factors that are going into your decision of where to live,
I think I agree that this is an effect that would happen. I'm not sure that I agree that it's like I don't imagine a large shift. I imagine something.
Well, so the thing about So obviously it depends on the size of the basic income, of course. And the thing about something like the housing market that's largely fueled by speculative prices is that the prices aren't just going to slow down or come down a little bit. You will, if it starts to come down, it's going to be a kind of a crash type situation because people are buying houses as investments. They're buying real estate as investments. And then as soon as they're expecting it to always go up. As soon as it's not going up as expected anymore, it crashes down. And that's kind of what we saw in 2008.
Well, so I guess the case I'm thinking of is like Silicon Valley. I have a lot of friends who wound up working in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Housing is horrific there. Because the realtors know that there are a bunch of software engineers going to work there who can afford to pay high rent, so they charge high rent. that kind of thing is basically not going to change, right? Those people are still going to be working as software engineers, even if you also give them UBI, unless you're suggesting that we should have fewer software engineers.
So, I mean, I think that's right. I'm not suggesting that we should have fewer software engineers, but there are people living in San Francisco who are not software engineers. And there are some people...
Do we think those people are doing jobs that are unnecessary or should be moved?
Well, they could be doing jobs either that are unnecessary or should be moved, or a lot of them might prefer not to live in San Francisco, but they don't have the resources to move. Like, I've been reading about this. Like, there are people who are...
Well, but if their job needs to be done, we still need to find somebody to replace that, right?
So if their job needs to be done, we need to find some way to replace that work. It doesn't necessarily need to be a person. It could be, a robot or something like that. So you could see people moving away from San Francisco, but certain services and products getting more expensive if you're replacing the labor with something that's more expensive than labor or something like that. Or it might just be the incentive enough to automate some of this stuff, and it might be a little expensive for a little while, and then it comes back down as we get more efficient. You might see laborers commuting in from out of town because now they can afford to do that more. Well, first they could afford to move.
Some jobs may not need to be, like, in aggregate, like if you have enough people move to another city, then maybe those jobs as like baristas or whatever else need to happen in that city instead of in the other city,
right,
to support the people that have moved to that city.
You also could see, if you have a lot of people who are staying in San Francisco or who want to move to San Francisco, now that everybody has a basic income, that could create a profit incentive for developers to build smaller, cheaper housing units as well.
At San Francisco, I heard that the minimum wage over there is $15 because, like a lot of people who are not software engineers that can't afford the expense of living over there.
Right.
But this $15 wage is affecting the restaurants and all. So now they have to, jack up their prices and all. They have to jack up the menus,
Right.
and they were already running on a thin margin. So I read this article in some magazine, and they feature a lot of interviews from restaurant owners. They mentioned that it's going to be catastrophic for the business because a lot of them are closing down. Some said they've closed a few chains in SF because now, they're running on very thin margins.
Right.
So that kind of, I think it will focus more towards an automated restaurants. I don't know, but I do know there's one in Boston or Cambridge, which is
Spice.
which is run solely on automated,
Yeah.
Are the waiters also, how does it work? I don't know.
They do have waiters, and I think they have a guy who puts a sprig of parsley on at the end once the bowl is fully formed. Yeah, or something like that.
Just for show?
For the human touch. Yeah.
I think SF might be, moving towards this, certain situation where, they could move to a self-serving thing. But yeah, the point is that for the people who are not software engineers, I think the idea was to give them supplementary income by increasing the minimum wage, but then that's affecting the businesses which are employing these workers.
Yeah, and maybe some things due to the minimum wage would get more expensive, and that can also help balance out the housing too. Maybe you're not willing to pay as much to live in an area if everything else is so expensive, that kind of thing. So there's all these kinds of different effects. I do feel that with a basic income, housing is probably going to get cheaper in a place like San Francisco. But other things might potentially get more expensive as the labor leaves. Yeah.
I think the idea of price is to demotivate people from moving in. If you can consider price as a force for rationing, resources which are in high demand. But in San Francisco, we see this weird trend where, I don't know, because of its popularity or its reputation, people keep coming over there.
But
so the higher price is an indicator of quality, and people spend more.
But we don't know the counterfactual. It could be that even more people would
data on.
If it wasn't so expensive, but I think it still could be deterring people.
It would be interesting.
Net positive still.
Should deter people, should deter companies from opening their offices over there.
There aren't really countries that have UBI.
Well, still, some of them
Iran
are
had something
outside of
pretty
San
close
Francisco.
for
They're
a
a
while,
little bit
and I
far
think there's a
further
lot
out.
of data there that we can
Yeah, I think you never know the counterfactual. You'd have to compare what would happen if things were cheaper, and my guess is more people would be moving there even than they are now.
Alaska has something close to a UBI.
They have that oil
Oil dividend, which is yearly. It's not the same amount every year, and it's paid yearly. But I bet you'd see some effects there on. This one we kind of covered. The trouble is a bigger economy uses more stuff than a smaller one, and we happen to live on a finite planet. I would say that this is kind of conflating resource usage with the size of the economy, or that kind of thing. So let's go to another one. Here we go. If growth is meant to have anything to do with increasing quality of life, there is plenty of evidence to suggest
let's talk about that.
that it has passed the point of diminishing returns. Even though the U.S. economy is 5.5 times bigger now in terms of GDP, i.e. production, than it was in 1960 in terms of real GDP, America is losing ground on its happiness index.
There's a lot of difficult things with this. One is that like growth, this is the size of the total like GDP, not per person or like how it's distributed, or not even per person, but it's not in terms of like what people actually have for the most part. So since we have so much more wealth inequality now, this might not really be reflecting the money that people have. So that's kind of one problem with inferring that giving people more money or something like this or more stuff doesn't improve their happiness. And another is, of course, there's just so many confounding historical events. Like a couple decades after World War II, things were very different in terms of social cohesion and attitudes and other things that might affect happiness that are not the case today. So I mean, it's a tough comparison.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, and obviously, like we were saying before, the economy is only one part of what contributes to people's well-being and happiness. But I think he does have a point that there are diminishing returns on the size of the economy.
Especially per individual, like.
Yeah, I mean, as you have more money, you're getting diminishing returns on each dollar. Like if your first $10 a day bought you enough food to eat for the day, like that's a much bigger difference than your last $10, which maybe contributed to your investment account or something like that.
But if you look at the individual data, at least on income, as sort of a proxy for the amount of stuff you're getting from the economy, like the diminishing returns don't hit until $50, $60, $70,000, where like it doesn't start to even drop, and it still goes up. It's just diminishing, but it goes up quite a bit before that. And most people in the United States, or like many people, don't have that. So I think that the size of the pie is not exactly reflecting the money happiness
point
relationship.
of diminishing return economy should be measured with the amount of needs they're solving.
And things like
there are
healthcare.
already like so many needs. Even if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an example. I mean, there are two of the top two, I guess, kind of. I don't know, they're pretty abstract, but the bottom three, like, your physiological security and I forgot the third one. So like three, like some of the needs are basic, but then again, like on top of that, your manufacturing needs to keep the economy growing. I think that's where you mentioned that, in a capitalist society, we need to keep growing in order for it to sustain.
Or that's where like having more time rather than money, like people don't have more time right now. Like even if they're making a decent amount of money, they're maybe not happy with how that time is being spent. So trading off some of that could be really good for like those higher level.
Yeah, I mean, if you keep giving people more money, but they don't have the time to enjoy what they buy with the money, then you're gonna that's a limit right there. But I think even without that, there's diminishing returns.
Bhutan, so it's like really small, and they have a really weird approach to tourism. So every tourist who comes there, like of course you need to pay for your visa, but then they restrict travel to an extent that annoys people. You have to pay to enter a certain city. Like they give you, if you have a certain passport, like certain visa, you cannot go beyond 3 cities.
Oh wow.
And because they say that it's hurting the economy. So they don't take growth, as a measure for happiness. And it said that Bhutan is one of the happiest countries in the world.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's not like the most richest, but
and it's hard to get into in the first place.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I can because I have an Indian passport, so we have some diplomatic relations. But then also, for me to go beyond those 3 cities, I would need to pay more to use a route tax, they call it, something like that. So you can 3 major cities. Beyond that, you need to pay a certain more. If you want to go to the wildlife areas, you need to pay a certain more. And then some areas which are completely out of bounds.
That's interesting.
Is their goal kind of to maintain their culture?
Yeah, they're very sustainable. You can't hurt any of the local wildlife, any cattle. You can't throw. If you throw any, let's say, waste, you're fined heavily for that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
So I'm kind of on part that I'm familiar with the case of Bhutan at least a little bit. which I find fascinating. Also, just the skeptic in me is thinking, well, they call themselves the happiest country in the world. There are some outside experts who say this.
Yeah.
North Korea calls themselves the happiest country in the world.
I don't know.
I happen to disagree.
How many outside experts?
Yeah.
agree with that?
How many
I'm skeptical of closed-off societies that don't like
Right.
travelers and reporters going through there saying how great they are.
Right. Like, how did they do those surveys?
So,
for example, that small island in India, which that American missionary tried to go in. I'm not
Right, and
sure.
they killed him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are 15 people living in the island. Indian government that's tried to bring them into civilization for many years. It was first the British that tried that for 200 years. They brought down to their population to almost an extinction. Indian government tried that. They didn't respond. They used to give them gifts. They used to give them books. They used to throw books from the helicopter. Nothing happened. They used to throw pineapples and stuff like that they needed. And now there you have an island which is occupied by 15 people. Most of them still nude, still using bows and arrows.
Wow.
And they're still happy. I mean, they haven't changed their lifestyle in over 60,000 years.
How do we know they're happy? Nobody's ever spoken to them. Like,
They don't like
Yeah.
to speak to anyone.
I would say that holding on to your culture is related to happiness because people really value their culture, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're more happy than other
also, like,
people on a different
to
level.
me, it sounds like these poor people are in a state of like total fight or flight, where anything out of their usual they immediately try to kill. That doesn't
Could be
sound
that.
happy. That
Yeah.
sounds paranoid in a state of constant war. That sounds awful.
I think it's hard to say.
Yeah,
how
and
happy
because
they
hard
are.
to say.
they've had like pollinators come in and like bring disease and people die, and so I think they're understandably skeptical about the outside world, and they're like, I feel like justifiably they've at this point been like, listen, we're doing our own thing, just like leave us alone. And
Yeah.
whether that's like happy or not, they're like, okay, like we've decided this is what we're doing, and people keep coming in and like being like fake missionaries and like, we need to bring you to Jesus, and they're like, no, like leave
I
us
think
alone.
one way to measure, like, if they're trying to innovate, to make things easier, I think that's one point, like, where people are unhappy. These guys haven't done any innovation at all for 60,000 years. The
Yeah.
closest they've been to,
Well,
like,
how do we know that these
I
aren't the
mean,
most miserable people on the planet?
It's hard to define what happiness is in that
I mean,
context
their
because they
suicide
live in
rate is
such a
really
different.
pretty low, so that's
Then maybe that tells us something.
I think it's really hard to define what happiness is in
Yeah, that's true.
like a culture that you can't like interact with directly. I think it's really hard to define.
I
What
try to ask people, like, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's really hard to define what happiness is in our culture,
Even in our
and
own,
this is one of the things I love about markets is that people can express their preferences, it directly.
Right.
And obviously, a basic income gives more people access to the market and more people the ability to kind of to make those decisions for themselves. And it's not to say that everyone always makes the right decisions, but yeah, I mean, happiness is a really, really tricky thing. It's a really, I mean, obviously you're a psychologist, so you know more about it than I do. But
yeah,
I think you would agree that it's complicated. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, like, it's especially complicated, like you said, across these cultural boundaries. I asked my friends who are anthropologists and, like, go study with small-scale societies, like, how do you compare the happiness? Can you tell anything? It's just, they really don't know.
Yeah.
It's just really hard to make these kinds of comparisons, like, when the culture is different enough.
Yeah. So I want to go back to a comment from Michael. He asked, is money growing exponentially when investors invest sustainable? And I would say, yeah. Money can, if people are growing their money and it's kind of sitting there and they're not, using up resources, that can grow indefinitely. And, like Jared was talking about pools of money just kind of growing and growing and growing. I don't think this is a problem. I think it's a problem when
To be fair, my complaint wasn't about the pool growing. My complaint was about large pools sucking up water from small pools. My complaint was that the proportion of money controlled by individual people was growing.
So I would say that large pools sucking up money from small pools is not a problem if we have a way to keep replenishing those small pools through something like basic income. And similarly, if people's money is growing exponentially, like that's not causing a problem directly. If consumer spending starts outstripping the productive capacity of the economy, then you have problems, and you have inflation and stuff like that. But in terms of money, as long as it's not being spent and using up stuff that we don't want to be used up, it's just money. Money is there are constraints on it, but the constraints are not how much of it exists or how much of it is in any one place or how fast it's growing or like It's how it's being used.
I have
in the economy. Yeah.
some sort of disagreement that money
Yeah.
grows money, because like I'm a business student, we're studying that.
Yeah.
We know that most of the investments, when you study venture capital, more than 80% of it is squandered. Like
Yeah.
if you were going to place bet on like 10 companies, that's why most firms, most hedge funds, they have portfolios of companies.
Yeah.
And what happens is that you're going to place bet on 20 companies, you're going to give each of them $100,000. Chances are that one of them is going to grow more than all the 19 combined.
Right.
Right.
So there's usually like this one company which scales so fast, especially today, like in the age of internet. Like some companies will scale really fast, they'll give you ROIs like crazy figures. Rest of them, they'll eventually die off.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think in the calculation there's an expectation of that on average
Yeah.
there's going to be some growth there.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of like
Right. In
yeah.
expectation.
I don't need to read this. We've already talked about all this, but we're getting towards the
Wile E.
end.
Coyote.
Wile E. Coyote plunging off a cliff. He thinks that if we don't, I can read
Yeah,
it. The
I
end of
read
growth
it.
will come one day, perhaps very soon, whether we're ready or not. If we plan for and manage it, we could well wind up with greater well-being. If we don't, we could find ourselves like Wile E. Coyote plunging off a cliff. Engineering a happy conclusion to the growth binge of the past century might be challenging, but it's not impossible, whereas what we're currently trying to do, maintain perpetual growth of the economy on a finite planet, most assuredly is. So I agree with him that continued growth is not necessary. I disagree with him that it's a problem if we try to continue to do this. I think it's fine, and he's conflating using up resources with the productive function of the economy. They don't exactly go with each other. Any final thoughts on growth, Bethany?
I think
Oh,
We're going to go around in a circle.
yeah, sure.
So Bethany
Oh,
first.
final thoughts on growth.
Or on this meetup.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think we covered most of my general thoughts. I think we didn't really get into the nitty gritty of like how to have really wonderful economic growth that benefits a lot of people while kind of using minimal resources or while being as sustainable as possible.
Yeah.
Like it might have been interesting to get into that a bit more, but otherwise I feel like we covered most of my points.
Okay. Pablo.
I think the way we measure growth needs to be changed. Like if, like in India, you're going to measure the amount of goods produced. I'm not sure how they measure goods in America. Is it like how much expenditure there is, or how much good you produce? Either way, like if you're just going to measure goods, like some of them, like the human resource being spent, some of them are useless. Like some of the goods being produced are not optimum. They're not using the resources well. The production of them is not productive. So I think we should measure growth in terms of productivity of time. So I think that will change our priorities to a bit. I think the way we measure growth right now is it's leading to certain problems.
Yeah.
Pushing those numbers itself, like I think that's the problem of your infinite growth.
Okay. Elizabeth.
I feel like I agree with a lot of what's already been said about sort of like, exponential growth of like usage of resources, especially non-renewable resources, is a problem. But that is a really limited way to define economic growth, and if it's more about just like, okay, how can we let people live to their full potential, like that, would produce arts and crafts and technology and stuff that can very much be done in a way that is like, ecologically sustainable and doesn't lead to like credit crashes and stuff.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, Sultan recommended a documentary, I guess you would call it, on Amazon Prime called Mankind, and the main point of it was that increased population sizes and improvements in technology leads to a virtuous cycle. So, like the printing press leading to the increased spread of ideas leads to like creation of nitrogen fertilizer, which creates
More food.
more food for people to increase the population. It keeps spreading and spreading. And so eventually, how do I say it? We might get to a point where we might not even need money anymore. We can't think of how there's like a quote that we can think of a world we can think of a world without something or other, but we can't think of a world past capitalism or something like that. Well, every system comes to an end. Feudalism came to an end. Like hunter-gatherers came to an end. All this stuff came to an end. So why can't we think of capitalism coming to an end?
Okay, Jared.
No, I'm all for that. Capitalism should come.
We went back to last week. Yeah.
I'm just now thinking we totally should have talked about population more.
We had one on that actually. Yeah.
Oh,
we had one on population growth. You can definitely check out the video.
Hans
on YouTube,
Rosling.
yeah.
Spoiler alert: population growth has stabilized already. It's a really cool video. Check it out.
Yeah. Anyway, continue.
Yeah.
But just because that's something that this makes me think of it.
Right.
Late in the evening, now that it's talking about.
Yeah.
What the
Definitely.
finite world? Well, that's always been the sort of Malthusian argument
Right.
Pick a number, some number out there is the maximum number of humans we can support.
Right.
After which point we have problems.
Right. Okay. I would just conclude by saying that I would love it if we measured the size of the economy by how much benefit is being created for people, for consumers. And that would kind of get to Pablo's point of, we wouldn't be producing stuff in a wasteful way because our metric would be geared to what's actually benefiting people. And in terms of growth, I think we can grow that. We obviously don't want to waste resources. Like Elizabeth was saying, there's finite resources, but that doesn't mean there's a limit to how much benefit we can provide consumers as we innovate and progress as a society. I'm happy to have that grow. If it doesn't grow, I don't think the economy is going to crash. I don't think the economy needs to keep growing in order to keep functioning properly. So I guess that's wrapping it up.
Do you have final thoughts there?
Andrew says, if we change our biological makeup just to be happy, so we're not running around trying to feel or find happiness. Yeah. So that's a good idea. Kind of hacking what makes us feel good. That's fun. And i.e. suffer.
Xbox and smoking pot all day is not such a bad idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suffer with dispensation of depression and have a strong need to purchase on Amazon. Do happy people with a good sense of well-being spend less? They might. I think certainly there is. What do you call it? Consumer therapy or shop therapy or So I think that's true. All right, guys. Great discussion. Thanks for the folks on the live stream and here. Next week we're talking about corporate monopolies and when they're good and when they're not.
I don't think they're good at all.
Tell it to us next week.
Yeah.